Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and we have 3 spoilers today to talk about from Flame of Xulta. It looks like the first batch of spoilers has been released, so those should be releasing tomorrow. We're going to see a whole bunch of them over the next week for sure from community people, so I didn't get one, but we'll see what else happens and like who got what, and also like you can hand off spoilers to the people. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Yeah, but we are going to talk about the 3 that are already released. The spoilers for Borderlands Lookout, another Nightmare Dragon, and the really exciting one that released this weekend. And we'll talk about those, I think, in order of excitement. So first things first, we got Borderlands Lookout here, the 0/1 +1/+1 for each type of influence the enemy player has. Elf Explorer. There's a lot of things to note about this card that are really decent. The first is that it is an Explorer at 1 with a most likely at least +1/+1 bonus, but occasionally a 2/3 for 2, or a 2/3 for 1, which, yeah, that's pretty reasonable. Like, there's a lot of reasons why that card might actually be strong. I think a 2/3 for 1 is really good, and I also think that Explorer synergy puts this card quite high on the list of available aggressive drops for time in general. Having a decent amount of health is pretty sweet. Like, the card does respond pretty poorly to silence, but for a 1-drop, like, it's really not too bad if that card gets incidentally silenced by something, and it's a reasonable thing to be playing out early on. I think the card has the stats to get going. It's also interesting that it's an elf in time, which is not a thing that's really been happening so far, but gives us a couple more options for like time primal shadow elves with the like Lithrai courtier and other types of things. So there's some interesting options there. So good tribal setup in general. Like, this card just has good tribes for the unit. It has good synergies with the kind of things that you actually wanted to have as a 1-drop. It's got a reasonable stat line. I would say it's at least a 1/2, and a 1/2 for 1 is okay as far as playability goes for an aggressive card. A 2/3 for 1 is ridiculous, and a 3/4 for 1 is, well, simply outrageous. So, like, this card really punishes the big triple color decks and the big, like, 4-color control lists. This is something that actually makes it a lot harder to play, like, very complicated and more, like, ridiculous decks. So it could, like, really have an influence on the meta. I think Lookout is probably going to see quite a bit of play in time decks, and I think it's probably going to be right up there with, like, Teacher of Humility and the 2/3 Amaran Stinger that, like, actually allows basically just time to do some really interesting and dominant things that force people to have certain answers in their deck or actually get a lot of losses in the metagame. So this is something that really can influence the meta. If this sees play, it'll definitely make a lot of difference, and I think that with the kind of stat line that it has, it probably will see play even though its incidental silence setup is a little bit weak. So if there's like some strong silence or some strong ways to just sort of get rid of this card without really looking at it, then Borderlands Lookout is not going to be that strong. But overall, I think there's a time aggro list that definitely runs this that is tier 1. So seems reasonable, definitely should have an influence on the meta, and kind of like forces the meta towards like more 2-color decks, more 1-color decks, not as many 3-color decks. So continuing the sort of trend from the previous set, but also, you know, like, since the new set has a lot of dual color cards, I think this card's going to be a 2/3 most consistently. So should be really interesting. Smelt Dragon is next. This card was from the LSV stream. We are just going to show that right now. It is a 5/5/7 drop with triple fire requirements. That triple fire requirement in particular makes this like a little bit tricky, just because it requires you to go very deep in a color that you usually don't want to go very deep into. Triple fire has traditionally been one of the hardest influence costs to get to, because unlike justice or time, there aren't a lot of ways to like really consistently draw and play power in fire. Fire is the worst at fixing, so anything with triple fire influence is generally going to be a lot harder to play, and you might want to be a little bit more down on it than you would other things. So triple and quadruple fire is just, it's not easy. Zoe is certainly something that you can play in these types of slots, and yeah, there's a lot of things that you have to sort of get moving on, but like, this is something that doesn't really go as well in hybrid decks and could feasibly be not that strong in those situations. It's a 5/5 Nightmare Dragon, flying, pay 7 to give Smelt Dragon +7 this turn, and summon kill all enemy relics. So it's got a fire breathing, but only fire breathing in the sense that if you are basically paying 7, you get to get an additional 7. And of course, like, if you have 14, you can get an additional 14. If you have 21, you can get get an additional 21. There's no once per turn on that, so the restriction doesn't matter. You can actually just completely blow out your opponent for 21 in this, which if you're playing in like a Justice, Fire, like Rakano Ironthorn build, that makes this card a lot more viable as a card that you can play, because even though the body is not amazing and the stats for it generally aren't that strong, this card just really functions as one of those like last card standing, where if both of you are playing out all of your tricks and this card is the last thing that you get to top deck, then this card just kills your opponent and your opponent doesn't get to do anything about it. That kind of power in the late game is actually really relevant, and this card also has the ability summon kill all enemy relics, which means that if you are pulling it out of the market or if you are pulling it out of your top decks, you get to mess up a lot of relic based strategies, including all of the big Justice strategies, the massive time cards like Temporal Distortion, and like even the small stuff like Crown and Mask of Torment that are so very common. So this definitely messes up like big relic strategies. It messes up the Aurelian relic strategy pretty well. I would say don't count this card out, even though it seems a little bit underwhelming, just because that fire breathing ability does actually come in handy a lot more often than you would expect, and because a 5/5 for 7 is not necessarily going to die immediately, even though it is monocolored, dies to annihilate, dies to desecrate, dies to isolate, and so many other things with 8s in them. Yeah, like I would say that this card is really tempo inefficient, but it's very good in control for all of the card advantage that it can grant you, and for the ability to just finish out a game if it is the card that you draw. Nonetheless, there are a lot of good things that happen at 7 and a lot of good things that happen at 8, so it's possible Stone Smelt Dragon won't see any play at all, despite the fact that it is pretty well designed for what it wants to do, and it seems like it's well balanced in terms of what it is trying to put together. So yeah, if relics become very common, I think Stone Smelt Dragon can definitely see play. Otherwise, this one's probably going to get relegated to 1/0s in markets for very specific kinds of decks, and I don't really love it in the market. I think it's much more of a main board card, because like overall you don't really want to grab attachment destruction that costs 7 and only kills specific types of attachments. I think you want this in your main board. You want to basically be pretty self-assured that your opponent has relics, and then you want to just blow out your opponent when you are feeling good. So hard to say if this card is going to be strong, but I think market conscious design it is not, so it's probably not likely to see a lot of play. But who knows? There are certainly some possibilities where the meta actually does suit it, and if that's the case, then pretty cool stuff can happen. Alright, last card was spoiled this weekend. It's pretty exciting, and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with it. There's also a couple of things that we need to specify here, so let's talk about Naheed the Immortal. 7 cost, time, shadow, so big ol' Xenon friend. 7/7, cultist, and at the start of each player's turn, they sacrifice another unit. If they can't, Naheed deals 7 damage to them. The first time you have 50 health or more, play Naheed from your deck. So on the turn you play Naheed, Naheed will blow up your opponent's things next turn. They have to sacrifice the unit, but if they can't, then Naheed will deal damage to them instead. So pretty good stuff just in terms of like, if your opponent doesn't have a response, you plop this card down, your opponent is going to have to sacrifice a unit at the start of their turn, and then they'll probably want to kill Naheed before Naheed kills them. Naheed, of course, will sacrifice your units, but if you're playing Xenon, you probably got some tokens floating around, you probably have some resurrection sort of setups that you can play around with. There's a couple of interesting options there. The first time you have 50 health or more, play Naheed from your deck thing is not as important, but is notable for a couple of different reasons. One thing that is important to know about this card is that you cannot play 4 Naheeds out of your deck with this ability. It only functions once, and I feel like that could be a little bit more clear here, but in general, like, yeah, basically this ability triggers similar to something like the Praxis Outlaw, where you will get it, the Naheed, and then that is the only Naheed that you will get, and then since it's the first time that you have 50 health or more, you don't play Naheed a second time, and you won't get to play Naheed again anytime that you have 50 health or more, so just 1 free Naheed out of your deck if you have 50 health or more, which in a Mask of Torment deck, a deck with a lot of Vara or Shadowlands Tyrant, a deck with a lot of life gain for other reasons, you can actually make this happen pretty reasonably. It's certainly an interesting free benefit to have, especially since a surprise Naheed from your deck at that amount of health means that your opponent is sacrificing a lot of position on board. Then you're playing cards like Xenon Temple for free on your turn. Yeah, like there's a lot of interesting options there where you can just basically get Naheed to do ridiculous nonsense. Overall, card is statted pretty well. Card has onboard impact that is immediate, although it does require you to play the card into a situation where there is no danger to Naheed the Immortal. Naheed is not immortal, so you need to actually make sure that there isn't a fast spell that can kill it on the turn that you play it. But as a 7/7, I think that you're probably safe, and if you're just like hoping that your opponent doesn't desecrate it, like a desecrate is definitely not a bad thing to eat as Naheed, because you also get the 7 damage onto your opponent, and you get the desecrate ability, which is really, really strong. Other things you can do with Naheed, if you give Naheed lifesteal with cards like Xenon Lifespeaker, then their 7 damage ability will actually deal damage and gain life, which is pretty sweet. You can also use it to trigger infiltrate effects, although there's not that many of those that are going to be in Xenon that you can play while also playing a Naheed the Immortal. Still, if it's a free card and you're playing it out just for free, then you could like slam a Debtor's Shackles or a Beast Caller's Amulet on this card, and it would immediately play the infiltrate effect off of that weapon, which is pretty decent if you're also playing yourself up to 50 or more through other means. So could be some interesting benefits there that you could fiddle around with. Keep in mind that this is direct damage, so on-hit abilities do apply, and there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with that. So not a bad thing overall. I would say that as a 7-drop, this is like really, really strong. It goes pretty well in a lot of Xenon decks. It's not necessarily a replacement for a Zindel in all decks, but it does make the life gain strategy quite viable, and since there is another card that actually makes a life gain strategy very viable, Unspeakable Torment, right now, I would say Naheed the Immortal has a pretty likely chance of coming out and doing some pretty interesting nonsense. We actually have a deck that I'm hoping to show off this week that will run Naheed the Immortal and have a pretty good time with them. So yeah, should be good stuff. All right, yeah, so that card's really exciting. I'm very interested in that. And the other 2 cards that we've seen are pretty interesting toolkits that do change up the meta quite a bit. So obviously, lots of new fun things happening in Flame of Xulta. We have some really exciting legendaries coming out in dual colors that are going to make a lot of those factions a lot more fun to play and should really change up the landscape, I think, a little bit. I'm looking forward to seeing like some form of competitive expeditions. I would really like to see basically expeditions get some sort of queue here so that we can play around with these cards in a non-set 1 environment. Like that would be really, really fun. And Expeditions is indeed rotating out set 1, so hopefully we'll see like some other stuff that actually makes this like a more competitive queue. If that happens, I'm very, very psyched for Flame of Xulta. Like this seems like a really, really interesting setup, and like overall I think this set has got a lot of cool cards going on with it, so I'm pretty keen to see what happens. Should be great fun. All right, that's it from me. Thank you guys so much for watching. For the YouTube folks, see you next time. And for the Twitch folks, let's get back to some games. Cheers.